Hi, this is Chuck Stell looking at international agricultural policy. As we talked about earlier, U.S. policy for agriculture has been to enhance farm incomes. And one of the results of that has led to higher domestic prices than there would be if we had a competitive market. That means that the domestic price is often higher than the world price, which would then normally attract imports from other countries because it would be cheaper for us to buy it from places which were at a lower price. But in order to prevent that from happening, the US government has decided to intervene in international markets, again, trying to maintain high farm incomes in the US. So these policies broadly protect farmers from competition by restricting imports in a variety of ways. Now, there are three specific tools that I'd like to look at: quotas, tariffs, and the tariff quota. So let me start with quotas, which in some ways are the simplest of our graphs. So quota is a restriction on the quantity imported. So in this case, let's say we're looking at the imported sugar from the Dominican Republic, and we have some equilibrium price, P star and Q star, the intersection of supply and demand. Well, the US government, in order to enhance sugar prices for the US sugar producers, sets a quota. So maybe they say 100 metric tons is the most the Dominican Republic can sell to the United States in a year. So that quota is labeled Q sub Q, and you can see it is a reduction moving from the socially efficient level, Q star, down to Q quota. At that quantity, P star is no longer an equilibrium price. And with a smaller amount of sugar being imported, the price of sugar will push all the way up to where it meets the demand curve at that quota line, up to P2. So the impact of a quota is lower quantities and higher prices. So this hurts domestic consumers, but it's doing it to try and protect domestic producers. Let me move to a tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports. So rather than putting a quantity restriction on sugar imports, the US government might put a tax on sugar produced in the Caribbean. So again, the goal is to try and get higher prices in the US so that US sugar producers have higher incomes. So if we initially started at the equilibrium point of P star and Q star, and then added a 60 cents tax to the supply curve, so that would shift the effective supply up to the blue line, right, the supply curve plus the tax, because not only do the producers need to pay all the cost of production shown in the supply curve, but they now have this extra 60 cents. We will see that consumers are not willing to pay 60 cents extra and still buy that same quantity Q star, right? If we go straight up, we can see that isn't on the demand curve. Instead, we're going to look at where the new blue line intersects the demand curve to find our new equilibrium for Caribbean sugar. So in this case, the supply plus tax line intersects the demand curve at the quantity Q2, so a reduction in quantity, and a higher price. So consumers pay more because they're paying that 60-cent tax. Now, notice that there is a third price on the vertical axis, and that is the price the Caribbean producers receive for their sugar. And that's going to be 60 cents less than the price consumers pay. So the difference between P2 and P2 minus tax is the 60 cents tax that the government is taking. So consumers pay more, producers receive less, and the government takes a share of revenues. Now, many students will have seen quotas and tariffs in Principles of Economics. The third type of protection that I'd like to look at is one that is relatively new and is used more in agricultural markets than in some other markets. And this is known as the tariff quota, sometimes also called the tariff rate quota. Essentially, it's a variation on the tax on imports, but a tax that starts off at a very low rate, maybe 10 cents a pound for sugar. And then once we reach a certain quantity, maybe 100 metric tons, then there's a big tax, maybe 60 cents a pound after that. So we have a period where there is a low tax. Once we hit whatever that old quota level might be, the tax then jumps to a high amount. If we put a demand curve into this, we can see a little bit about what happens. It's really common for the demand curve to strike someplace in that vertical region, simply because there's such a big discontinuity there. And so what's most likely to happen is that our quantity will reduce from Q star to Q2, and the price will increase from P star to P2. Right, so again, the impact is higher prices and lower quantities for US consumers, but again, the benefits are going to the US producers. A separate policy that the United States and some European countries also engaged in was to subsidize exports. The problem with having the domestic policies to enhance US prices is the domestic price became higher than the world price, and that meant that our exports would be uncompetitive. And so a policy that had been used was to pay farmers the difference between the domestic price and the world price so that they could export and sell at the price in the local country, and even though they're going to receive a higher price in the United States. Since the end of the Second World War, there have been some very important international trade agreements that have tried to promote free trade. They were originally called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. So those began in 1947, and these did a lot to reduce trade barriers, particularly for manufactured goods. About a tenfold decrease in taxes on imports across the board. Now, there wasn't very much progress made on agriculture and agricultural free trade until the very final round, which was in Uruguay, ending in 1994. As part of that round, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade were renamed the World Trade Organization, and so they do continue to this day. So the World Trade Organization did get members, after years of negotiation, to agree to open their agriculture markets. And so this was something that most countries in the world agreed to. And there's really three elements. One was to eliminate quotas, and that was sometimes known as tariffication, to replace quotas with tariffs, and that's where the tariff quota became popular. The second part was to negotiate reductions in tariffs, reduce the level of taxes, and that has been broadly agreed to, but there's been controversy over the specifics of how much tariffs should be reduced for each commodity. And the third broad point of the World Trade Organization Agreement on Agriculture is to reduce subsidies. So one would be to eliminate export subsidies entirely, and the second is to design farm support programs that have less distortion, particularly the programs that caused incentives for farmers to overproduce. And so one of the reasons some of the U.S. commodity programs changed was to try and be in compliance with the WTO agreement. So for about 70 years, U.S. policy has promoted free trade, both in Republican and Democratic administrations, in manufactured goods, and more recently in agriculture. We've been seeing fewer restrictions on imports and lower tariffs. Now, our current president reversed that. Donald Trump was very concerned about the U.S. trade deficit, and he imposed tariffs on much of the rest of the world. These started with steel and aluminum and then spread to other products. Other countries then responded, and this is the idea of a trade war. So in retaliation, other countries imposed tariffs on U.S. produced products, and they particularly focused on U.S. agriculture. So the U.S. is a major agricultural exporter, and many countries imposed retaliatory tariffs on the United States in response to Trump's tariffs on steel and manufactured goods. So for instance, Canada put tariffs on prepared meats, fruits, and vegetables. Mexico put tariffs on pork, cheese, and vegetables. The European Union put tariffs on grains, juice, and peanut butter, among other products. And China put tariffs on almost all U.S. agricultural products. Now, the consuming countries were easily able to find substitute products. Most of these goods are commodities, and buying soybeans from Brazil or Argentina or Australia will satisfy the consumer demand. But what really happened here is that U.S. farm revenues fell substantially. The taxes were enough that it made U.S. producers uncompetitive with the rest of the world. As a result of the drop in rural incomes and farm incomes, there were new massive federal assistance programs that were designed to offset some of those losses caused by the trade wars. And so this was more money on top of the normal farm aid that was part of the Farm Bill. Now, negotiations over trade have been ongoing, and the U.S. has dropped tariffs on certain products against certain countries, and other countries in response have reduced their taxes on U.S. products, including agriculture. So it is a process that continues, but overall there is still substantially less free trade now than we had before the trade wars. This has been Chuck Stull from Kalamazoo College talking about international agricultural policy. Thank you for listening.